Thank you guys for coming out. Good Lord, look at you. December, starting to get a little precipitation of some sort out there. Here we are. Not an empty seat in the house.
Hanukkah just started, you know.
Time to get started?
Hanukkah just started.
That's right. Happy
absolutely.
Hanukkah. Thank you
I
for
think both.
reminding us. I saw the mitzvah truck outside. Most importantly. And you know what? I tried to get gelt for everyone and failed. Whole Foods does not sell it, but there is a form of chocolate. That was water in the back. If anyone wants chocolate for Hanukkah. Thank you.
So Jamie and I were really happy within the last 24 to 48 hours because we both got to read a book. And it's been a minute, at least for me. And she said it's been a minute for a single sitting for her, but we both had to go single sitting, busy people that we are. And I got to say, I absolutely loved your book.
I loved your book.
All right.
Big
Fantastic.
fan, big fan.
And yeah, so I guess we're just going to chat with each other for a bit, and then we'll chat with you guys for a little bit. And I'll go Q1 if you want.
Sure,
All
you
right.
go.
So Jamie's first hospitalization was, she was very young. She was right before the start of her senior year, but she is young for her class. And one thing that I found was interesting is people often ask me, were there signs when you were young that you were going to be bipolar? And I always say, I don't know. I did some stuff. I drove my car into a grocery store. It was automatic sliding doors. I got in too many fights.
Wait, you drove a car into it?
Yeah, I didn't break the glass, but it was like, just the automatic thing. And I kind of idled up, and I had the Star Wars theme blasting at full volume,
Okay.
as you do. And I was just
Wait, how old? You were 16?
Might have been 15. I'm not sure I was supposed to even be
Okay.
driving.
Just want to get all the details
Yeah, but-
going.
Yeah, I did some stuff. We just kind of bump, it was really loud.
Got it.
And kind of just pretended the guy that was screaming at me, I couldn't hear him. And I always say, I don't know, I did a lot of reckless things, but I had friends that were sitting right next to me that haven't spent 45 days of their life in a psych ward. And the first thing that fascinated me about your story is you kind of unequivocally had a psychotic break when you were really young, and your diagnosis came very young. And for me, I didn't even know that was, you could be diagnosed that young. But I thought you did a remarkable job after that hospitalization for a 16-year-old accepting that something was wrong. And it seemed like after initially being very resistant to medication in the hospital, once you took to lithium, you realized this can help, and you submitted, and as far as I could tell, you were compliant. I think many adults, I know I did, had a tough time coming to terms with their diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And at 16, you don't really know who you are, let alone who you are post-mental break. So my very long-winded question is, can you kind of tell us about what that's like being so young, having that diagnosis, and then how you were able to accept and deal with that as best as you could at such a young age?
It's a really good question, and I think that there was a benefit to being really young when I was diagnosed, in that I was unformed. I didn't, less formed maybe than having an adult life, an adult sense of who I was, a profession, goals. I kind of didn't have a choice not to take the medication because I felt like I had seen what had happened before. I'd been hospitalized, I'd been tackled by nurses, I'd been, really in a terrifying place, as manic episodes are. They're really, really scary. And there was no way that I could go back to that. And so I took it. I took the lithium because it was something that seemed like it was going to work. It was presented as the only option, and I wasn't going to not do it because I didn't know another way.
Well, I think some ways we were both helped by the fact that both of our first breaks were just so violent and so out of control and so fantastical that
Yeah.
for me, I thought I was running around Manhattan thinking I was being filmed. As part of a TV pilot that no one told me we were going to start filming, but I was pretty sure we'd started. And I was in the hospital for 7 days with my mom there every day telling me, this isn't a TV show, before I was finally like, okay, maybe that is just a security camera. And I think we were both maybe blessed in some way. You were fighting wars in Nicaragua. You were talking to Michael Jackson a bit. You ran away from your father and tried to take refuge in a
super fancy restaurant.
Super fancy restaurant.
Super fancy restaurant. And they were super nice. And they thought my father was abusing me, which I think actually, I don't know how much damage that does long term to a relationship.
Well, in some ways, you say good on the restaurant owner that might be following protocol.
What restaurant was it?
Prado on Larchmont Boulevard in Los Angeles. Still there. Still good. Although I haven't eaten there in a long time, but I've heard.
But I think like we both took a benefit from like having them be so crazy, because for me, I didn't really know what bipolar was when they first said you have bipolar disorder 1 and you've got a fierce case of it here. But it was hard for me to go, yeah, no, that was kind of a bad week.
But let me ask you this. Do you think it takes getting to that level of crazy to get a diagnosis? Because I definitely, a couple years before, had experienced some form of not functioning. And I think people didn't know. My parents didn't know. My therapist, who I was actually going to, didn't know. And I felt like, it got severe eventually, but there was that sign was there, and that was in relationship maybe to, having been sexually assaulted when I was 13. It was like there were some things to look out for, but maybe it takes that kind of extraordinary experience to actually get a diagnosis, because otherwise people aren't paying attention.
Yeah, I'm not sure about to get a diagnosis. I mean, I'm not saying I disagree.
No,
I'm not sure. I just don't know really. Like, I know people thought something was wrong with me many times growing up, but you make this point that like, how can we say the adolescent brain is exhibiting adult symptoms of mental illness when to be an adolescent is almost by definition to be mentally ill?
Right. Right. No, it's true.
So I think it's kind of hard to go like, well, did Zach pull up to the grocery store and drive his little car in one too far? Is Zach getting in fights all the time because he's mentally ill, because he's depressed, or is Zach just raising hell in the TA?
Well, right. That's the line that's hard, where it's hard to know, right? Even after I was diagnosed, even after I was miserable my senior year in high school, I was still smoking pot after adolescent group therapy and driving Mulholland home, which is like
on the roof,
stupid.
On the roof of group therapy, right?
Yeah, terrible idea. But I was making bad decisions because I was like, this seems like a good idea at the time. It was a bad idea. Don't do it. But
one thing that blew me away is when you were hospitalized at 16, and after you'd been tackled several times and you'd been injected so many times that you were bruising on your hip, and you still were totally out of control, and you absolutely didn't. You didn't know what was going on, and you had no control of your mind or faculties. You weren't running the show. They put you in seclusion, which I've been in several times myself. And the way you described it was very similar in the bad parts of it and how I remembered it. But the first time I was put into seclusion, it was like an 8x8 cell, and they were both padded. You described a much smaller space where you wouldn't be able to even lay down. But that was the first time in weeks, maybe months, you eventually calmed. And we both had the same reaction. As soon as the door shut, we panicked. We were, banging on the walls, screaming, crying, "Let me out!" Mine had a little window, just as yours did, and that still strikes me as, a somewhat barbaric course of treatment. But you found almost like a womb-like calming presence about that room, and it eventually,
Yeah.
and it seemed to me, like, I mean, I was getting claustrophobic just reading about it. It being, it's so small.
It might have been because you had been there and felt like you knew that space, but I can't explain why that was so comforting, but I think part of it was that I knew I couldn't function. Like, I was aware, like, I had gotten to the point where I knew I couldn't do anything and that I needed to be separate from people. I mean, I was like trying to convince everyone to join my war and like trying to get them ready for battle. And these were all people on my psych ward. Like, they weren't wanting to go to battle. They weren't wanting to go to war.
Maybe some of them did.
Maybe. One of them just wanted to watch TV. I mean,
TV
it was
did.
fair. When going back to your question, though, about not knowing if you're bipolar or not and whether or not your childhood could, like, you hinted in your book a little bit about banging your head against the wall. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that a few times, and it struck me as something that I wasn't sure if you were describing it because it was out of the ordinary, or you were concerned in retrospect, or that it was something your mom mentioned to you. Was that something that you found was...
I mean, she told me about, I've heard that story a million times. She told me, and it took me, I was probably into my 20s before I would no longer say I had a psycho temper. And I think I kind of attached myself to that story in a way that had some sort of sick pride, an element of sick pride, because I think like being fiery like that, either with anger or just force of personality, is a thing that, like if I had become a linebacker, right, and I played for the Steelers or something, you might hear John Gruden say, "This kid, when he's 2 years old, his mom said he used to bang his head against the wall. That's how intense this guy is,"
So
But
we want more concussions.
Right. But yeah, I mean, I thought it was a fact worth noting for readers that, that was some behavior that I exhibited when I was young.
Yeah.
Whether, if I don't go to a psych ward, that just becomes a little footnote, like, haha, you're a horrible
Right. You're
handful.
angry.
Yeah. And I found the age that happened to you so fascinating because I had never heard of it being more than these little symptoms. Like, okay, you've got that. You're a toddler, and you could be a kid that had a child psychiatrist. You can ditch school. You can do drugs. But like I said, once we both hit a brick wall, and that was obviously, made it easier for us to reckon with what we have. Mm-hmm. I kind of don't worry about it anymore, like whether that presaged anything or not, because, it ended the way it ended.
Right.
It took the path it took. It's almost like a question I think is more interesting for researchers than me to contemplate. So I kind of spend my energy trying to function now. And,
Mm-hmm.
There was obviously there's years where you process these things, and especially as they keep occurring. Which brings me to something interesting you told me the other day when we were having noodles together. You said writing this book is very different than my experience. You said like writing this book was really emotional for you, and sometimes you'd spend your writing days half writing, half doing normal writerly procrastination, and then half curled up in a ball crying.
No, I was watching NCIS. Come on.
But crying at NCIS? Or?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay.
Come on now.
There were tears while you were writing this. Like it seemed like
yeah.
Yeah.
There were definitely tears along the way. Yes.
Well, and I like so when people ask me about reliving things, I often say like was it hard to dig this up while you were writing it? And I often say like it was hard to live it. Like I felt like, I was writing it from a place of distance about events that happened to someone else. It started to feel like a fictional character to me. And I'd even ask myself as I was writing sometimes, like, would Zack do this? Like, does that work in here? And of course, you got to make sure it's true and go back and like, well, Zack did do that. but I kind of got in the head of the character, Zach. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about like when the tears started flowing during NCIS.
Yeah.
What were what were some of the things, the memories that you dredged up that were particularly painful? And do you know why you were having such a strong emotional connection to the material as you were writing it?
So it wasn't any memory in particular. And I wonder if our experience might have been different because I wrote it a little bit further out after my last episode than you did. So that a lot of it, like I had not thought about it in a while, and I had not thought about the episodes, and I hadn't really, gone back to them. And that when I went back to write about them, I re-reported everything, and so I interviewed everyone who was involved. I interviewed, Mike. I interviewed people I hadn't talked to. I interviewed my parents about all of it, and it was funny because my parents are really open people. They're very open about being bipolar, mental illness, and therapy, and but we'd never really talked a lot about the first episode. We never talked in detail about it. I never talked to, my mom or my dad specifically my dad about, how hard it must have been for me to be running down the street saying you're abusing me, like in public, and then telling a restaurateur that he was my abuser. And, he's a very button-up, lawyerly kind of guy, and he was not really able to deal with that. And so I think maybe that did dredge up some stuff, but it's just, it was a lot of the work was hard, the work was intense, on top of it being raw in general.
It's kind of just the emotional drain of working that hard in some ways. I mean, you get so fatigued that
Yeah.
you're dealing with a sensitive subject, and then you're exhausted physically and mentally.
I
On
think
top
writing
of
a
that.
book is hard too.
I think it was.
That's pretty
I think
much.
it's hard.
That's enough to warrant watching a lot of NCIS.
Yeah, I'd agree. I would agree with
Both
that
Los
wholeheartedly.
Angeles, New Orleans, and the other one. I don't really like the original, actually.
Well, so
But what was your experience like? So you didn't feel that kind of intense emotion. You felt a little more removed from it.
I did 2 times. I got really emotional in the process. And this is maybe the most arrogant thing a person has ever said. But the first time I read the prologue that I wrote, I cried, and I cried really hard. So my own writing made me cry. That's just how moving it was. But it was about, the first line of my book is Granny hates the pigs to this day. And then I detail this beating that my schizophrenic uncle took on the front lawn at the hands of 5 or 6 cops, while my grandmother, who I'm very close with, watched, and my grandpa watched from the porch as the police restrained them. And I knew him well. He died when I was 15. I was actually born the same day that he was taken to the state mental hospital for the rest of his life. And for that reason, me and my grandmother have a very close bond. I was kind of his replacement. So it wasn't just that the writing was so beautiful. It was that.
But it was.
It was that I could just see it. I know the lawn that it occurred on. I know what my grandma's beehive looked like then. My grandpa's been just as bald for till the day he died as he was that day. I could just smell the beer on his breath, and I could just see sirens and them wailing on him with batons, and I could see my mom pulling up, and I just kind of lost it thinking about,
Well, did you relate to him? Because you had created this scene that you could have been in. Like he could have been a proxy to you.
I might have. I didn't think that of like any of the pain that I was feeling coming from that, but we do look a lot alike. We both went, he kind of lost it earlier than I did, but we both ended up, spending, him way more than me, but we both ended up spending significant a significant amount of time in psych wards. And he was a cool guy, but for the schizophrenia. Like I did kind of, once I quit being terrified of him because he looked like Charles Manson, but like right before he died in my adolescence, I started noticing like the 70s swag he had, the chain wallets, he's hand rolling cigarettes, he listened to really cool music. So once you realize that when he screams in your face like, ah, that if you just scream back, ah, nothing happens except he goes, got any ganja? I was always like, buddy, I don't think you're allowed ganja.
Right.
So maybe there's a little bit of that. But yeah, I think it was mostly just watching her watch her son get witness what would have looked like getting beat to death. He could have died,
Right.
and like, could you imagine anything more horrible than not only losing a child, but watching it happen violently in front of your eyes at the hands of the state? And the other time I cried was reading my mom's journals and just realizing how hard her life was at 28, especially looking back at 33, 34 when I was finishing the book. Like, 28 was old to me when she was 28. And then I knew, like, oh, that's what my 28 looked like. I was running around the East Village and the Lower East Side having a grand old time.
Mm-hmm.
She was divorced with 3 kids, $27 in her checking account, and, living in a house with mice and tack strips everywhere and working full-time at a grocery store and, 10 years married and divorced, 28.
Right.
So I cried then too. But other than that, it was kind of just like trying to remember what happened and trying to make it entertaining. It came, it's work, as you know.
Do you feel like, you just mentioned this idea of a mother watching her son almost get beaten to death. And in a way, that's what mental illness is, because you never know if you're going to return, and the people around you never know if you're going to return, and your mom doesn't know. Nobody does. And so do you feel like with each episode that she sort of fears that, and it's like a repeat of your granny? Totally.
I mean, the first one, she'd never been to New York. She got a call from the NYPD that they had me, and they'd brought me to Bellevue, which she knew from Law and Order and nothing else. So she got out there, and I've naturally have a fairly stocky build, but she looked through the window of the psych ward and saw, a guy that was totally emaciated, had the wild eyes. You talk about the wild eyes. Had the wild eyes. I had a mohawk. I had a handlebar mustache. So I can't imagine that first gut punch. But then a year later, my next hospitalization, where I'm, going through like just blazing psychosis for nearly a month. I don't know how she kept coming every day and, keeping enough faith to think like, he's coming back. This is not going to be an Uncle Eddie situation. I think toward the end, she did start having conversations with my sister about like, if I die, you got to take care of your brother. I think
that's my brother's biggest fear, and that's why he lives in Cairo. He was like, forget it. It's not happening.
That reminds me, going back to like after you had your moment of clarity in the padded cell.
Yeah.
That again makes me. It reminded me of I read a story once about how Saddam Hussein tortured the Iraqi volleyball team after they had a less than stellar showing at a certain Olympics, and he built a box for them that was too small for them to stand up in. And I just like imagined you, and I was like, wow. And then that is where you had your first slice of serenity in weeks. But then your brother came, Matt. Mm-hmm. He came to see you, and they let you out for a moment to have a visit with him. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't that you had, this reckoning like, okay, something's wrong, and then now I'm on lithium and I'm out of the hospital and I'm stable for a while.
Right.
You thought giant squirrels were roiding up and...
Well, come on, let's be honest. Squirrels are scary.
Squirrels...
Always. Like, whether you're manic or not, squirrels are scary. They just have fluffy tails. They're rats.
Facts are facts.
Yeah. Let's be truly honest.
But you had, like, I had the same thing. Like you get stable sometimes in an episode and in the aftermath of the episode, but even after I got out of the hospital and was just drugged to the nines and comatose and lucid, several days later I'd had this flash of psychosis where I'm hearing little squeaks in the garage, and I genuinely thought that perhaps they were lollipop kids for a moment. And I wondered, when you went through that period, like after you got out of the box and after you were kind of accepting that you were at a place in a mental hospital where maybe you needed to be, how did you deal with those aftershocks of, just these little blasts of psychosis that would come? And do you remember like how long that happened after you stabilized to some extent?
In high school, I don't remember that well. It was a long time ago because I'm super old. But I know that the recovery part is hard. Like, it's harder and different for each episode. Like, it feels like it's really different, and it's really different for each person. Like, I think that there's no way to say this is a cut and dry path to take and you're going to be fine. And I think that medications are not always easy. Like, there's always juggling what's going to work and what isn't going to work. And while I think I kind of romanticize the idea of like lithium worked and then I was fine and everything was okay and I went to college and it was great and I, did a cake stand and blah, blah, blah. Then I moved to New York and I got a career, blah, 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 blah. But it wasn't like that. Like, I think that, I was deeply depressed. I had no friends. I was... you're uncertain of who you are and what's real. And I think you probably had a sense of that too. Or maybe I should ask a question if you did. Like, there are moments where something might be fine, but you question it. And it's just hard to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Mine, I had several moments of that. As you say, it's not a like boom and then okay, there's this line of demarcation. That was that episode, and now here's life. I had the moment the night I got out of Bellevue. I looked in the mirror and my pupils were still dilated, and I still saw those crazy man eyes. And I looked like my Uncle Nettie, and I saw this mustache that didn't belong on my face and this haircut that didn't belong on my head, and the word psychotic break kept playing in my head. They said, you had a psychotic break, and this word psychotic, 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 psychotic. And I looked at myself and I was like, I'm psychotic. Not I went psychotic, but I am psychotic. And I went and like collapsed, and I talked to my mom and I was like, have I been like this my whole life? Like, is that why? Is my little brother terrified of me? Is everyone terrified of me? Mm-hmm. Am I actually psychotic? She's like, nah, you're not, and
that was nice of her to say.
Yeah, that mopped it up nicely for me. But the next 60 days for me were figuring out just who the hell I am, because I was flying high. I was a lawyer. I was a comedian. One that was about to be really successful as far as I was concerned. Much like your...
I feel like my second episode matched your first episode very well. Like, we had very similar symptoms.
There was a lot of one-to-one there.
Yeah, we both... I feel like if only we had met, we would be battle rapping right now. Like, if Miles and Jemiah had just...
You want to go?
No, absolutely not. No. But there were so many things that were so similar. And one thing that struck me was you starring in your own show. And you mentioned the Truman Show complex, I guess. But there is this sense, I think, do you feel like your manic episodes represented the culture around you?
They had to, right? You can't think you're on a reality TV show before reality TV exists, and you can't, or at least not before TV exists. Mm-hmm. You'd have to be, you'd have to have the ability to predict the future. You'd have to be really out there crazy to get that, and just, flat out beyond genius. But
do you ever feel like sometimes the bipolar, stuff does predict the future? Because there were things like in terms of just being, not to go into like really dangerous territory, but when I feel like that symptom of always being tracked, always being listened to, always like having people follow you around, like that was stuff I experienced when I was in high school and there were no cell phones. And now I feel like this is what's happening. This is the reality. I'm like, I knew that shit was happening. Like that was about to happen.
Well, in like 2009, when I went to Bellevue, iPhones were not as common as they are now. So
Yeah.
I was walking down the street still thinking like, okay, well, he might be picking up a little audio with that. He might be picking up, some stills, maybe that's just that's going to be a grainy little walk-by shot. I'm glad it didn't happen in 2017 because I could still be walking out around there just like smiling for everyone. It's not only iPhones now. Everybody's got a camera of that quality or higher, just snapping pictures all over this place.
Also, there's Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to totally leave a record and fuck your shit up. Like you can ruin everything.
You can.
Within like a 24-hour foul swoop.
When I had my first episode in 5 years this spring or summer, I didn't think I'd ever have one again, but I did. And I didn't fuck everything up in one fell swoop, but wow, I wrote an email or two.
Please describe those.
Well, I was trying to get my friend Omar, who lives in Qatar right now, to Kansas. And he really did have a ticket to Kansas, but Trump put it was like the
ban.
Yeah, he put that country on the list like a couple days before he was supposed to fly. So I was hell-bent and determined to get Omar to Kansas. And in doing so, I emailed almost every media and journalism contact I have, anyone I've ever worked for, anyone I've ever pitched, and said, let's play a little game. It's called Get Omar to Kansas. This could be a great story. Like, we'll all kind of work together. I hit some legal aid lawyers. Like, we have the best immigration lawyers in the world. We have the,
Why did you want to get him to Kansas?
Because I was in Kansas. He was gonna come hang out. But I CC'd Ira Glass. I hit up quite a few folks. Then, I did a piece for This American Life last year, and I talked to my producer I've become good friends with, and about a couple weeks after this happened, and I told him I had an episode, and he was like, when? I was like, think about it hard, you'll know. And he was like, all right, give it to me. I was like, you recall an email I sent around a couple weeks? I was like, oh. It's like, I thought that was kind of an interesting idea for a pitch, but now that you mention it, it was a bit half-baked.
Oh, This American Life. Wouldn't that be like the worst case scenario if they actually assigned it?
Oh, I'd take it.
But it would be like, I mean, yeah.
Long as they plug the book at the end. Yeah, we'd take it, right? But going back to the figuring out who you are post-episode, again, being impressed by certain, in some ways, you had this maturity level in processing that, where I was just thinking, when you're a teenager, you absolutely don't know who you are, and you're absolutely trying to figure it out, probably more so than any phase of life. And it seems like an achievable thing, I think, then. I feel like you always think figuring out who I am is just around the corner. Whereas the older you get, you might go you get some perspective and you go, yeah, I'm 35 and, I know who I am, but I know when I'm 45, I'll look back and go, I didn't know who I was at 35. You don't have that perspective at 16. But you had to sit there and go, I'm trying to figure out who I am as a teenager, how to kiss boys, how to make friends in the lunchroom, who to sit with.
But all that goes by the wayside when you're diagnosed bipolar.
Absolutely.
Right? You're none of that matters.
And you have this, I just can't imagine doing both of those loop-de-loops at the same time.
But that was the thing. That was what was so great. I didn't do I didn't do any high school. When people ask me about high school, I didn't really go. I ditched all of my classes. I did the bare minimum to get into college. Nobody should do this who's a child if they're here. I I basically became that. That was who I was, is that I was diagnosed bipolar. That's who I understood myself to be. And that was like the way that I moved forward, was just dealing with that and that alone.
You've got a great little section in your book where you talk about that, and you say, you tried to care about parties, you tried to care about drinking, you tried to care about who kissed who, you didn't give a shit. I didn't give a shit, what you said at the end of that little thing. And like, I totally identified with that, because I felt really bad, because like, she has to go and try to figure out high school. I had to go and try to figure out the first day of work again. And I was a lawyer, and that was tough. I mean, it was real hard, but I just, I couldn't imagine walking into Wichita Northwest High School and being like, how you guys been?
But the thing is like, in so many ways, though, you had a real life already set up. Like you said, you had this job, you had this passion for your clients and for trying to help them and do something. And you had real stakes. High school, there are no real stakes. Like they feel like real stakes, but they're completely artificial. Like, no one really cares about prom, really. And if they do, they're sort of like, they're not the people 10 years down the road you want to hang out with.
Yeah, 10 years post-high school, you hope you didn't care much about prom, looking back. But I mean, I think there are stakes, maybe not in that, like, oh shoot, I messed up my AP Calc exam, but there are stakes in that, like, we make choices, and you start snorting a little cocaine young enough, and like, that's really high stakes, because it makes it much easier to continue to snort cocaine through your 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
And we all have friends or acquaintances or family who have done things like that, and I'd argue that, I mean, there's very high stakes there. In Kansas, I know way too many people who started smoking meth around then, and none of them turned out to be Rhodes Scholars. Anyway, I was kind of blown away with the difficulty of you having to do that, but I was glad that you had the fortitude to skip school too and go, fuck it, I'll just go deal with this thing.
Movies are like
2 a day.
They're good. Yeah, that's the movies. They're great. I wanted to ask you, because I felt like, and we talked about this over noodles the other day also, the difficulty of writing about your family. And all aspects of it. I feel like I wrote about my family, but I think I did it always with a rosy coating. And I think that was probably that was very specific, because I didn't want to get into certain issues that were not necessarily related to being bipolar. But what was it like for you when the book came out? What was it like writing about your family?
So writing about it was really fun, because my family's...
It's rollicking. I mean, you feel it. There's like a real verve to
They're
it.
hilarious. I wish they were less funny, because then I could have made a choice not to write about them. But like, I just couldn't. It's like they're too good. They write themselves. And I probably didn't give enough thought to the fallout pre-writing it, and in many ways I'm glad I did, because I went as hard as I wanted to go, and that's what landed there. The last few weeks, months now, have actually been pretty hard in that regard, and harder than I thought it would, because I'm not close with the McDermott side of the family, but some feelings were hurt really badly. And I feel and felt worse about it than I thought I would. My uncle, who's in the book, in many ways it's easy to go, screw that guy. He's racist. He's casually racist, but casually Kansas racist. And there's, he got really upset when he saw a picture of me on Facebook in some short shorts once at the gay pride parade, and called me up and said, some folks back here are worried about you. So he's a guy that, if I tell a lot of my liberal friends in New York, they're like, yeah, fuck that guy. Who cares if his feelings are hurt?
I mean, he's still your family. It's still a reaction to what you're writing. And I think that's always hard to both process, and sometimes it's internalized in some way.
Well, that side from what I've heard, but it's just from him, has disowned me. I don't have a relationship with my dad, really. I haven't heard from him, but I don't know if that's business as usual or if he's jammed up about the book. I didn't necessarily know they would like even read it. They're not huge reading crowd, but I, in some ways I underestimated Uncle, not saying his name, because he sent me some like, really like cogent and persuasive texts. Like, and he had me Googling stuff. Like I texted him back and was like, "Hey, I'm really sorry you're hurt. Wasn't my intention, whatever I said." And he wrote me back, "Opera non verba." And I was like, "UD." Get my Google on. I was like, did I have, maybe my portrayal is completely inaccurate.
Yeah.
Maybe you're much more learned than I thought. But yeah, it's felt bad. Like, and I love going to Christmas at my family. It's just this, I feel like I can say white trash because I identify, but it's this just absolute white trash jamboree of chili scooping and, farting armpits and, push-up contests on your knuckles in the garage and stomach punch contests, and it's out of control. But I don't get to go this year. And I'm kind of jammed up about that part of it. I actually gave my dad a copy of the book, and he said, "Am I gonna like it?" I was like, "I don't know. Critics do. You'd have to, you'd have to open it." And he said, "Am I in it?" And I was like, "Well, your name's on the cover. It's one letter different." But yeah, that I got a little long-winded on that answer. But I've been disowned by half the family. The other half of the family thinks I'm, fantastic. You can guess which side. It's the bird side is
You gotta like.
pretty stoked. Yeah. Yeah. So I want to ask you about, and this is kind of bringing it to collateral at best topic, but one thing that fascinates me is the parallels between the treatment for a radical bout of mental illness and the punishment for a crime. Psych wards. Like when you have an acute episode of psychosis, society's solution is to incarcerate us. I mean, it's not incarceration in the traditional, what you would think of when someone says incarceration, you go to jail, but it's number 2 on the old Webster's dictionary of incarceration. Like, we are literally incarcerated when that happens. And I feel passionately about incarceration, and I'm, very strongly against it as punishment for a crime. But as I've kind of been able to talk about mental illness and our experiences and going to psych wards, it's began to strike me as more and more absurd that is a cure or treatment, almost like first, like that's kind of our first move.
I mean, I would say that they don't know how to deal with us. I would say that there isn't a good, like, I think the psychiatric care in general is like totally it's like really still in its infancy. It feels like that to me. I mean, it feels like psychiatric wards are holding pens, like you're saying, and I'm cutting you off, so I'm sorry.
Keep going.
You should do it. Do your thing. But I think also meds are also so difficult to get right, and they're so hard to, it's so hard to convince patients to even go on meds. It's so hard to get people the right cocktail of meds. It's so hard to convince people that they need them.
I think that's the only argument I can get to for why that's kind of an acceptable way to treat it, is that you definitely couldn't have talked me into going to a psychiatrist and taking a prescription before I was forced to. That said, you know, and some people will say, like, what's the solution? You can point out a problem without having the solution, but I think if I had one little proposal to improve it, it would be that as a society, we need to really be more familiar with the symptoms of mental illness and bipolar disorder and schizophrenia from, you know, I didn't know what it was until I had it. And I think it's easy enough for people to know the symptoms of bipolar disorder just as well as they do the common cold or flu. And I'm not saying 30% of people or 60% of people wouldn't still resist medication once the symptoms of an episode take hold. But I think there's a chance if from the time I was like 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever, if we were taught, like, you know, you might start writing on the walls, you might start sleeping with people you wouldn't otherwise, you might start talking to people 24 hours a day, they might not be listening to you, you might think that...
Well, isn't it interesting we're not taught anything about psychiatry in school? Like, there's not anything in high school really about it?
I think you could save a lot of time, pain, and money if we were. Because I still can't say whether I would have been like, yeah, you guys are right, that does sound quite a bit like bipolar disorder. But I think there's a chance that if my roommate had said, hey, when I went to sleep, the walls were white, and when I woke up this morning, every single inch of them were covered in red magic marker. This sound, you remember those those videos we used to watch in third grade?
The power,
this kind of
slideshow
looks a lot like that. And you remember yesterday when you were telling me about your photographic memory and how you could remember every conversation you've ever had verbatim since kindergarten? It's, you know, slide number 2, if you remember that VHS we watched. I think you could maybe capture, it's hard to put a number on it, but I don't think it's like too optimistic to think maybe 50% of people would be like, they should probably get down to the old urgent psychiatric care center.
What do you do then when you see someone, because I feel like we live in a city where the mentally ill are not cared for. And so they're either put in jail or they're on subways, or occasionally Shirley McRae, who does great work with mental illness, will be able to reach out and find people, or they'll reach out to her. But when you see someone on the subway who's clearly exhibiting crazy, what do you do?
Nothing.
Right.
The exact same thing everybody else does.
But we know, and we still, like,
I'll give $1 if he's asking. But,
like, how does that change?
Well, you know, I'll tell you what I do in my head. I go, it's so stupid that someone won't hand that guy 2 to 4 milligrams of Risperdal. Like, just stat, you know, if we got him on that for, I just kind of armchair psychiatrist it. And I just think how much easier and better it would be if we all kind of both knew that that's what was needed and gave a shit enough to, you know, reach out to that guy on the subway. It breaks my heart. I think it breaks almost everybody's heart when they walk by that if they see it. But, you know, I was telling this story the other day in an interview about, I was walking by this guy who was ripping up paper bags and then putting them in another paper bag and ripping up more paper bags and putting them in a paper bag. And I had nothing for him except $1 if he asked. And our social safety net can't be the kindness of strangers, $1 at a time. So other than, like, you know, railing for healthcare for people.
Well, we definitely need, well, there's that.
It's really frustrating because we care, you guys care enough to have showed up, but I find myself hitting this point of, you know, as an activist, if you want to say, where I'm like, I want that guy's bed to not be a dirty mattress that he threw on the ground outside of a church, but without us, you know, both running for Senate in red states and winning.
Right. I mean, because there used to be more mental health options. I mean, in the 80s, before Reagan shut everything down, and switched it to prisons, there were services and there were ways and options for people to get help.
Well, and now sometimes the getting arrested can be the best thing that happens to someone that's, going through a hardcore psychiatric episode, and that's horrible. I mean, you absolutely shouldn't have to. You won't
That's
get.
a bad society.
Yeah, you won't get it if you commit a minor crime and go through the system. Your attorney's just going to get you out of there as soon as possible and not try to get you treatment, because their duty is to their client, and their duty is to keep their client out of jail. Make them serve as few days, minutes as possible in jail. So even if you think like, you would do well if we got you a mental health program monitored by the court, that's not it. You have to minimize their exposure, sentence-wise. But yeah, you almost have to get, if you don't have health insurance and you don't have a support network and you don't have a family, you almost have to get scooped up and incarcerated and do something pretty bad before the court will go, you need mental health treatment. And there's these, the statistics, like they say 40% of people on Rikers Island are mentally ill. I'm no social scientist, but anecdotally, I would argue it's much closer to 90%.
Yeah.
Almost by virtue of being there, we have quite a few indicators that something went wrong. And, I'm crazy hippie left of Bernie that, thinks we should open Attica, and just kind of let everybody out. But I don't, I just totally lost my train of thought.
You're a hippie.
Yeah.
That's what you were saying.
Well, I'm going to get it.
How do you...
It was a great landing. I was working up to. Yeah.
Should we open it up to questions?
I think that's a great time.
All right.
Could you read from your books before you do the questions?
Oh, Zach didn't feel like it, but...
You can put that on me. I mean,
How am I going to know if I want to buy the book?
that's a good point.
Whoa.
I could bang out a couple pages. If you want to bang out a couple pages.
All right, well, I need to...
You first.
I could read your book, you could read mine. That'd be funny, because you could be the girly voice, right?
Yeah.
You go first.
All right. I'm going to do the shortest thing I can,
What's the title?
which is the prologue. The title of the book is Gorilla and the Bird. I'll do the prologue because that's as short as I can keep it for you guys and have it make any sense. All right, here you go. Granny hates the pigs to this day. If she's in a friendly mood, she'll call them the fuzz, but never just the police or even cops. Most often, it's the pigs. Zachariah, look out the window. Is that the pigs? She'll say that in the same voice she uses when she says, look, there's a cardinal in my bird feeder. Nonchalant, lacking any malice, it's purely observational. There's a bird, there's the pigs. One night in 1978, the pigs beat her son Edward senseless on her front lawn while she watched. My uncle was sitting in the cab of Pa's truck, stoned out of his mind on PCP when the cops showed up. First 2 cars, then 3, then 6. When they started pounding on the driver's side window, Pa told them they didn't need to do that. Let me talk to my son, and I'll get him out of the truck. He was told to stay on the porch, sir, then to stay on the fucking porch, sir. Soon he realized he should not have told the cops that Edward was strong, that he didn't know for sure what he'd taken, and that his son wasn't in his right mind. They interpreted that as, please beat my son's ass because he is definitely going to try to beat yours. Edward came out swinging once they got the door open, so high on dust that he didn't know he didn't have a chance. They beat him and kept beating him with their billy clubs while he flailed and resisted. Then they beat him after he quit flailing. Then they beat him after they cuffed him. Then they maced him. Then they kept beating him. My mother, the bird, knew why her parents' house was lit up in blue and red before she got close enough to see the cop cars covering the front lawn. Edward. It couldn't be anything but Edward. Pa was on the porch, 3 cops forming a moat around him. He was howling, crying so loud she heard him before she got out of the car. Edward was in the back seat of one of the cruisers. The blood matted his hair down and caked his cheeks. His face was starting to swell, but he'd looked much worse in the morning. He was smiling. Granny couldn't talk for several hours, and what she saw that day would haunt her forever. Edward shackled and maced and bathed in police lights, getting bludgeoned by 6 men with wooden batons. Her husband screaming and cussing and crying and begging. Sirens ringing in her ears. Black baton hitting skull with the same pop as bat hitting baseball. The beating was brutal enough to have killed him, for sure. At what point could she be certain that it hadn't? Never. And if the beating hadn't finished him off, the PCP might still have had something to say. The Sunday after Thanksgiving 1982, a few months before I was born, my schizophrenic Uncle Eddie suffered his last overdose on angel dust. He was airlifted to Kansas City with a heart aneurysm. The procedure they used on him was new enough that his case was later chronicled in medical textbooks. The doctors gave him less than a 30% chance of making it through the surgery. His body survived, but in many ways that was the end of his life. After the airlift, Granny and Pa stayed with Edward in the Kansas City ICU until just before Christmas. Granny prayed the rosary, Pa drank whiskey. This last overdose, combined with his already severe and untreated mental illness, erased any lingering hope that he might someday be able to live anything approximating a normal life. The skits and the addiction, proverbial chicken and egg, had swallowed the man. He was 26 years old. Granny and Pa didn't want him institutionalized, but he couldn't live on his own either. He could barely control his own body. Given his age, Granny and Pa couldn't just tell him he had to live at home. In an attempt to regain guardianship, they went to court. Things didn't go according to plan. The judge lifted their burden of care entirely. They were denied guardianship. Edward was ordered to enter a state mental institution in Topeka. On the day the men from the mental hospital came to pick up Edward, my mom went into labor with me. His last day on the outside was my first. It's not all that funny, I promise.
Sorry for throwing you under the bus. I apologize for throwing Zach under the bus. I don't have anything that is quite as succinct and lovely.
Stop it.
Difficult. Okay, so I believed I had special powers. The report noted I knew when the end of the world was coming due to toxic substances and felt that I was the only one who could stop it. I tried to tell everyone in the waiting room, but they were too busy crying over broken bones. This was the end of the world. This was not a drill. One persistent thought, a gut instinct, was that I was the one, the only one, a prophesized being, special, sent to Earth with a mysterious mission, one that I was just now understanding with each passing day. I was Jesus, I was Bob Dylan, I was Hitler, I was John Wilkes Booth, Derrida, Marx, the Monkey Wrench Gang, a bear, a pile of glitter, and a galaxy. I was in an action movie, a war movie, a rom-com. I was the protagonist in all of these, of course. I had to warn the population at large about the future nuclear, God damn it, and this annihilation, war, genocide, apocalypse on the highest scale, bigger than biblical. I would fall in love along the way. I would recruit this love to fight the larger epic war. The feeling was that of incredible pressure and responsibility. I could not believe I was tasked with this. I was only 16. I was an average teen. But this is how superheroes are born. And I'm going to skip to a portion of the second episode. So that was... Thank you, Zach.
You got it. One-handed mic and paper.
It's hard. Yeah. Sorry. No, I'm just going to read about So that was the end of my first episode. This is fast forwarding to the second episode, which was after New York, and my apartment burned down. Everyone survived, though. Don't worry. By then, Mike and I were yoked to each other. We disappeared around the corner to shoot more important camcorder footage for the censorship project, which at this point had come to include a second documentary about my burnt apartment. On the sidewalk, we kissed again, which seemed to be the real point. He returned me back to the Chelsea Savoy at 5 a.m., and we kissed again goodbye. See ya, he said in a tone so casual it belied what was clear to me. I had met my soulmate. I was going to LA the next day to visit, but not to stay, and he was my fire neighbor. He was intrigued, addicted to the mania, and devoted, following me around with his video camera, recording impromptu dance recitals and monologues. Mania, or even the beginnings of mania, will do this. There's a magnetism to that kind of high, and I knew I could draw people to me. I had drawn in Mike. I had plans. I had a concept of myself as an anarchistic cult leader in a gold tutu. If Mike wanted to be part of that, fine. If not, I would find another Mike. On camera, I talked about utopia. I talked about a utopia I planned to build and rule. A place where inhibition was not welcome, a place where creativity reigned. To get there, we had to break through the norms of society, to end censorship, and to make free speech freer than water, to be naked in body and soul. I yelled about the people I admired, like Chris O'Feely, like NWA, like Eminem. I thought about Eminem's lyrics constantly on loop. I am whatever you say I am, or even more direct arguments against censorship, like his lyrics from Who Knew. There must be a mix-up. You want me to fix up lyrics while the president gets his dick sucked? Eminem, the number 0, living in a utopia in the trees and morphing into fairy creatures. I could see the next steps past the pizza party. I guess I'm referencing a pizza party I'm at. I'm sorry, I picked this at random. And so while clomping through the meatpacking district, passing transgender prostitutes and Florent, I could feel my luminous future, and Mike was tangled in it. As Sylvia Plath wrote, when you are insane, you are busy being insane all the time. Yes.
So we're very short on time, unfortunately, but we have time for about 2 more very short questions. This gentleman first.
You know, you talked about coming across people on the street and what you might do, but if there was a family member who was an adult, first of all, thank you so much for this evening. I really appreciate it. But for a family member who's an adult, who's not necessarily gotten locked up, or has been locked up or let out, whose help is available, but would rather live on the street than take that help, what would you? How can you help someone like that? How can you help someone who you love, who chooses not to submit?
I've never personally been in that position. I've been on the other side of it a lot, but I would say patience is the first thing that you need, because it takes a long, long time, and it's a lifetime worth of working with somebody going through that. Like, it's never completely over, I think. Do you have any?
I mean, I can quote my mom, and she has this little saying. She says, when people are at their worst, when you're repulsed by them, when your instinct is to run away, what you really need to do is go toward them. And I think that's beautiful, but in the scenario you're talking about, it probably, that a beautiful little saying that you could, put on a tapestry doesn't really get it done. So I think you just kind of have to continue to be open, continue to be persistent, and not give up trying to persuade. But when someone's an adult, it is very hard. So I think all you can do is try to be there, try to persuade, be as unthreatening as possible, be as non-judgmental as possible, and just kind of try to walk them to the water.
And keep remembering that they're them, I think. Like, sometimes I feel like I've been such an asshole when I'm manic and a terrible person. And I think I've made very close relatives, my mom, my dad, my stepdad, my stepmom. I've really alienated a lot of people and been completely lucky that my closest friends and relatives continue to be part of my life even after that, and accept that that isn't necessarily representative of who I am. And I say necessarily.
Hi, I really look forward to reading both of your books. So I have a comment and a question. You can call 311, or you could get the 311 app on your phone for homeless outreach. I do it all the time. I feel like it's better than doing nothing. They will dispatch an outreach team within an hour to wherever you're, saying the person needs help. Of course, they always have the right to refuse, just like you have the right to refuse medication, So that's at least one thing that maybe you can do that might help. So I'm curious if you guys had a similar experience. When I was 25, I was hospitalized, Lenox Hill Hospital, 8th floor. And while I agree with the incarceration piece, right, hospitals are not places to necessarily get well, they're places not to die. I found a fellowship amongst the people in there. So I was terrified initially, one flew over the cuckoo's nest terror before I went in there. Once I was in there, I actually sort of found an openness, a vulnerability, and a safety to some degree amongst my fellow, inmates. Did you guys have you had similar experiences to that?
With one or two people I did, but most of the time I was just terrified and wanted to get the hell out of there. And one of the guys, in my longest hospitalization, that was at Osawatomie State Hospital in Western Kansas, there's two guys, one I bonded with more than anyone else, and one of them was in for double murder. He'd been found not guilty by reason of insanity, and they had us all mixed in together. He was an all right dude. And then another guy was a guy who insinuated that he wanted to rape me in the shower for the first few days. But he had a stuffed monkey on his shoulder and made me kiss the monkey and was always running around going, monk, 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 monk. So we kind of got through the first few days, and we sat together at dinner. He wore a fine dinner jacket every evening to dinner, and I just kind of would joke with him when he would, say things like that. But yeah, it wasn't anyone that I was like, well, we're definitely going to keep in touch when we leave.
I didn't. I think because it was high school and because there weren't any other bipolar patients, it was just me and eating disorder girls. There was one drug addict, and we were all, 15 and 16 and 17. There wasn't a lot of sort of cross communication. I mean, we had grouped together and we cared about each other while we were there. But I think beyond that, it was really hard to sustain a relationship because it was such a specific time and such a specific place. That said, that when I got out and was in adolescent group psychology, that group was everything to me for that year. It was my peer group. It was, the people that I felt like I could talk to, and they were not in high school. They were not at my high school, at least. And so I felt like I could actually speak.
There we go.